Mirrors are important because the world inside the mirror and the world in front of the mirror are both necessary to each other, but radically different. They structure the human psyche, which was the beginning of Lacan's body of theory, grounded by the human infant's prolonged dependency and slow development. One could say that this is the reason for language acquisition, or that language, in fact, is the reason for the human child's delayed readiness. Suppression as a function of metaphor leads both to the idea of the unconscious, which is not recognized by standard psychology, and the idea that the unconscious is necessarily structured like a language. Without the unconscious, there can be no proper view of the first societies, and every ethnological account thereafter will structurally be flawed. Only Vico, 150 years before Freud, happened on the correct idea that metaphor and the unconscious were two linked ideas, and the radical misunderstanding of Freud, Lacan, and Vico are at the basis of our continuing problems in architecture theory. Adam and Eve feel the need to dress themselves at the same time they commit a crime and are punished. There must be a connection. The idea that the visible world was also permeated with crime and punishment is there from the start, at the moment when humans gain an awareness that is simultaneously a self and other awareness. That means that the body is visible by another who is invisible. Just who is watching Adam and Eve? It is a construct that comes from our entry into what Lacan has called the symbolic, meaning the language-like relations we have in all kinds of ways with all kinds of objects, people and other beings, including fears and hopes. Once we can have an idea, our perceptual world, what Lacan called the imaginary, is forever changed, split, we could say, and Lucas Cranach tells the story by having a tree, a place we can return to enjoy fruit again and again, but a serpent in the tree, who seems to be there to correct the balance by adding pain to pleasure. When we wonder why up and down aren't reversed in the mirror the same way left and right are, we fail to consider our error in saying that mirrors actually reverse things. We interpret, but don't take the responsibility for the role of interpretation in making the reversal appear to be so obvious. We suppress the idea of the cut because we need to stabilize the visual world, domesticate it. We are aware of our position in the center of the visible world, but deny that it is also at the periphery, at the boundary between what can be seen and what is invisible, both inside and outside. This is the position that Hitchcock puts us in from the very beginning of his film Rear Window. Our self-awareness imposes the idea of position within the visible world, which we think of as a mobile point in relation to an expanded field. The point is vulnerable because as soon as we see, this implies that we are also being seen. This is an awareness that, for animals, occurs even at the cellular level with photochemical adaptation of appearance to create camouflage that allows the animal to hide from its predators. Humans, animals who speak, have an additional, or should we say, subtractional reaction. They must conceptualize being seen as a consequence of seeing, and this forces the speaking animal, the subject, to split the world along subject-object lines, beginning with the world in front and the world in back, which means that although we are free to turn around, we never get more than half. We never escape from the line drawn down the middle. This means that we identify with the midpoint, the split, the screen, and are conditioned by the two aspects of the circle we have cut in two. If you could imagine distilling the two poles of difference that result from this cut, one would be the subject of representation, which relates to the need to repeat, to turn up again, as something that guarantees or validates appearances, and its antipode, the gaze, which refuses to turn up at the same place at the same time, but is nonetheless always present as a void. The human perceiver, who faces the screen and is both the maker of the screen and constituted by the screen, is split by these antipodal forces, which is why Lacan indicated the subject as an S with a line drawn through its middle. The screen divides, but it also is the result of a fold that superimposes the two triangles, pointing to a universal function of anamorphosis, the condition that allows, within the visible, alternative visibilities that are in dialectic tension. This is a general rule. If something is visible, it is visible anamorphically, with a potential power to conceal. And what it conceals is another visibility. Naturally, given that visibility also establishes directionality and valences, this anamorphic sub-property means that directionality is more complex. For example, Descartes' optics had to struggle to determine whether vision was a matter of forces going into the eye or coming out of the eye. But eventually, the passive eye won, and extromission lost. But the truth is that both vectors are balanced by the fact that our vision is directed by desire, an outward vector. In Rear Window, we would characterize Jeff's curiosity in his neighbors as an outward vector, like an arrow or bullet, and we say that photography is a kind of shooting. Foucault, however, tilted the balance in favor of aligning the gaze with power in every case. So his example of the panopticon prison became a matter of assigning power to the guards located in the tower that was shielded from the view of the prisoners. And the guards were credited with a kind of extromission that compelled the prisoners to behave correctly all the time, although they never knew when they were being observed. Some feminists immediately transposed the idea of a power gaze to the male gaze, and wanted to screen themselves from being observed involuntarily. And so the gaze was converted into exactly the opposite of what it actually was, which was a void in the field of the visible. Without the idea of a void, the panopticon would never have worked, and Bentham had originally gotten the gaze's location and direction correct. Foucault reversed it, along with many feminists. Joan Kopchik tried to correct this, but was not well understood. This means that there is no full separation of the relation between seeing and being seen, or the subject and the gaze at the subject. They are in relationship through the full range of the visible-invisible relations, but there is a figure-ground reversal that happens from end to end. Where the gaze is a figure, or rather a void on the field of the visible, it becomes the ground of the subject as seen by the other, but it retains its aspect as invisible. This figure-ground change relates to situations where the subject is held in one place by either the shelter or imprisonment of architecture. This is why it's necessary to talk about idempotency, the power of the same, or x plus x equals x. The split in the visual field is radical and hard to conceptualize because our need to normalize the imaginary within the symbolic, using Lacanian terminology here, forced an oversimplification. A painting such as Holbein's The Ambassadors, which marks the official beginning of artists' technical interest in anamorphosis, is like a performance on the stage of a theater. The audience seems to stand in front of it. The actors look out into a dark space, unable to clearly see those who are looking at them. Of course, in the painting, the actors are long dead, and the audiences keep parading in front of them. But again, the idea of seeing and being seen is complex. The subjects of representation here clearly could see at the time the painting was being made. They were looking at Holbein, with his easel in the studio where they had brought all their goodies. Now they and Holbein are long dead, but they keep looking. We watch them, but we do not see us watching, any more than actors blinded by spotlights can see the audience. They know the audience is there and can visualize parts of the auditorium, of course, but basically performance assumes it is seen without seeing. And the audience enjoys the visible performance with the guarantees that it is doing so from a position of concealment. In other words, reciprocity in both the theater and in painting is canceled, with the result that the screen that splits and anamorphizes us as seeing and speaking beings can be objectified. How? Holbein gives an elaborate formula for doing this by making the edge of a painting into a hinge and creating a half-symmetry by including a blur that, seen from the right angle, can be correctly viewed to be a skull. How do the mirrors work? Why is left and right reversed but not up and down? The mirror is not a reversal machine, but a cut made through the middle of a space that creates two equal halves, a reflected half and a reflecting half. As a plane cutting our line of view, it works by returning the fields left to right, right to right, up to up, and bottom to bottom. We do not see the reflection as we would a photograph where subjects with lefts and rights must turn around to face us. When we understand the mirror as a cut rather than a reversal, and when we force ourselves to recognize the role played by our need to conceptualize the mirror, we use the cut as a device of self-mockery, something that develops an autonomy and power to contradict. In other words, the topological 2D correction of our idea of space and time has dramatic consequences and potentials. For instance, we can imagine the separate existence of our reflections and shadows. This is not just an illustration from René Magritte's famous painting, but a demonstration of the central role played by projective geometry, which is the logical basis of Euclid, but not discovered until 300 AD by Pappus of Alexandria. The question of what projective geometry was before it was projective geometry points to the role of the uncanny, which is foundational for human thought, evident in the early human practices, beliefs, and rituals, and preserved by the forms taken by stories, which, as narrative structures, kept the idea of chiasmus intact. This is the principle of punctuation, and the reason for having two kinds of criticism, one by the cut and one by punctuation or closure. We can look to ethnography, art, literature, and popular culture to find out about projective geometry, because the idea of the projective 2D surface that is both finite and unbounded is literally everywhere. Even if it is unlikely that anyone in architecture or even in psychoanalysis is going to master the mathematical principles of projective geometry, it will be possible to find recognition of its effects and rules in art, literature, and popular culture. The interesting question that emerges from this alternative learning source is, how is it that non-geometricians have managed to master projective geometry in such a way that they can explore its potentialities? And how is it that they have used projective geometry in ways that have stayed true to the nature of the 2D surface? Ovid's retelling of the Apollo-Daphne story portrays Daphne's flight as if it happened on a 2D surface, and the role of Apollo's double arrow of love and hate is mathematically correct. One possible answer is that projective geometry is recognizable as a cosmic element, the kink in reality that unsettles our stable Euclidean view, which is always the view of the sober, practical consciousness. Yet Euclidean perspectivalism is full of holes and weak points that can be pried open by projective geometry, and this has been going on for so long, since mythic times, that artists know all of the likely weak spots and work on them in traditional ways. The regression to infinity is one of them. Once I ran into an artist in Louvain, Belgium, who painted scenes with little tricks in them, like changes of scale, and he told me that the Walloon Dutch painters were experts in the application of kwinkslag, or little joke. Naturally, I can't pronounce this correctly. We don't have to wait for Einstein, however, to tell us that space is not infinitely extendable. We can start with the river Oceanus, for example. So when Hercules sails around the visible world, he is simultaneously making a 360-degree circle, a 720-degree double circle, and a 180 passage across into another world that is called Hades. The Greeks knew how to represent the outer bound of the visible as also an inner bound. So why can't we get used to this idea? This cuts into the idea that space is homogeneous by showing how the contradiction, the kwinkslag, shows the truth of the truth, making it a second kind of virtuality associated with effect and effectiveness. Our sorrow at watching a sad movie is made possible by the exception, the possibility that someone might be able to take the same sorrow as enjoyment. We can extend this audience reception issue to spatial boundedness, to have the machine-produced object at the center of our attentions into the vigilant warning system of something beyond our protected auditorium. The screaming actress is impulsively warning the audience that, if they go outside, there will be something horrific awaiting them. This is the idea of Louis Buñuel's Exterminating Angel, where guests at a dinner party find themselves unable to leave the house. It is uncanny and makes no sense at all until we realize the geometric truth involved, that the center will be a kind of automation conditioning the periphery. The artist will always get it right. The 1945 British thriller is an anthology of ghost stories built around an architect's visit to a country house to spec out plans for renovations. But he has a déjà vu experience that gets the other house guests to tell him their own spooky stories. This one is about a mirror that a woman finds in an antique shop that had belonged to a wealthy but paralyzed man who went mad with jealousy over his wife's infidelities. He stared into the mirror so long that the mirror was permanently engraved with his murderous intentions, which stayed with the mirror until it was purchased again by the modern woman as a gift to her betrothed, who then becomes maddened with jealousy. This is a kind of folktale, but it's consistent with others that portray the ability of the medium to become the means. All we have to do is pay attention to the details. So when a master like Velázquez takes up the matter of projectivity, we are in for a treat. The debates about this painting seem to divide scholars between those who insist on Euclid and those who recognize the implicit projectivity of a painting that must by definition be a self-portrait, which must by definition be a cut in the middle of space, but where that cut is portable and convertible as a figure over ground into a ground over figure. Nonetheless, Velázquez manages to obey the Euclidean rules to show how projectivity happens in the midst of an ordinary-looking world. He just plants the little monster in the center of things to alert us to the presence of the kwinkslag. We need to be as acutely observant as dead of night and Velázquez, and one way to do this is to look at some of the mathematics behind projectivity that can help us articulate its principles. When Lacan looks at the phenomenon of merger, he realizes that Euler circles are different from Venn circles. They make us pay attention when something that happens that is okay for Boolean logic turns out not to be okay in experience. Venn circles expect us to accept that the overlap between two circles would be a union and an intersection, but Euler would require us to say that there is no intersection. This creates what is called a symmetrical difference. What is missing in one circle is present in the other, but in a non-oriented and twisting way. The space in the middle is a void, a no man's land, and the lozenge-shaped margin around it is actually a double movement that performs this twist. We can find examples of this literally in history, where no one cares about projective geometry, as in the case of No Man's Land, the space between two stalled armies in World War I. We have to pay attention to the idempotency element, the stalling of the armies. This allowed the middle to be the inverse of what was around the border, the opposite political forces. Inside, deserters from both sides formed a perfect utopia of multinational, fair-minded, mutually supportive citizens who had a common purpose of survival and existed both outside and inside the two nationalities that produced their space. Let's return to the visibility and visibility issue, the two little triangles of the gaze and the subject of representation. With the Euler circles, we see the formation of the screen, the middle element, as a void with an edge that circulates and reverses figure ground, inside and outside. With the exchanges that are made possible by the central void, we see a crisscross that is itself accomplishing the idea of bijection, the indexical, but at another level. Language itself is not a code, but it allows an interior code to develop as long as it follows the rules of non-orientation and self-intersection. In the case of Hitchcock, this has already been explored by Tom Cohen using the idea of cryptonymies, which show how Hitchcock paid attention to themes and devices across the full range of his career, and how this made him into an auteur, although he didn't know the first thing about projective geometry. This allows us to attach Lacan to Hitchcock because both of them are doing psychoanalysis, one from the private subject to the public subject, the other from the public subject, the audience, to the private subject, the individual experience of suspense and fright. On behalf of Lacan's expression for fantasy, the barred S for the subject, in relation to the little a, the object cause of desire, we see how what the audience cannot see is the basis for relocating fear at the dead center of the individual spectator, and how this is simultaneously what happens in any scary movie, but what is mimicked on the screen in the story of Rear Window. What makes analysis like Pelasma's so disappointing is that it never connects or could connect with this kind of scholarship. It remains stuck in its bijective mode of interpreting individual elements to captions, ignoring the way the film develops desire in actual human subjects. If we recognize the role of projectivity, we can easily move from Rear Window to projects that are theologically and historically foundational for architecture, such as the Tower of Babel, where it becomes critical to note the ambiguity that all artists of this first unfinished architectural project have been able to note, that the top is possibly unfinished, or ruined, or simply invisible. The painting has to be able to make a case for each of these, which are options of the mutual causality of seeing and being seen. Connections like these are simply unavailable to bijective critical tagging, which goes under the name of interpretation, which is why Susan Sontag said she was against it. Freud articulated the idea of the death drive when he came up against shell-shock victims of World War I who were unable to remember their original traumas, but were compelled to revisit and relive them. This return loop was both painful and pleasurable, and to break the cycle, Freud had to understand the complementarity of pleasure and pain at the level of neural circuitry. But without having to be neurologists, how can we manage? Lacan offers, thanks to projective geometry, several options, beginning with the Borromeo knot, which, for his system of the real, imaginary, and symbolic, show how any two domains depend not just on a third, but on the absence of a third. This keeps us from saying stupid things about the imaginary, and allows us to understand witty artists such as Escher, who talk about filling a space completely because the fill is based in bijective but inverse complements. Lacan would go further to mention that the Klein group, where any two elements are combined because of a third, would play into this and make the binary of fishes and fowls a matter of creating an invisibility, that is, a field. The ich, the I, the human ego, will be necessarily palindromic and symmetrical, but only in the way that negation and lack work. And if we go a bit further than Lacan did to do what's called a Gauss notation of the Borromeo rings, we find a pattern of holes that is like the twist of the missing elements in the Euler circle's interior void, the vesica that is the shape of desire that doubles itself as it moves. The movement theme can be portable thanks to the pattern of the void. One artist who noticed this to his advantage was also good at ciphering, Edgar Allan Poe, who used visibility as a means of creating invisibility, as if he had his geometry textbook at hand. Of course, the 19th century was the heyday of projective geometry, so maybe this stuff was just in the air. But Poe's story of the letter hidden out in the open mentions the game of Mora, the odds and evens played with the hands. So we know he was thinking about how stupid police would be thinking bijectively while the smart detective would imitate the smart Minister D, and not just find the letter, but plan his escape route. Just like Odysseus in the cave of the Cyclops, it's not enough to blind your rival, you also have to get back to the boat. Odysseus's joke was to call himself Nobody, because he predicted that the Cyclops would have to call on the other Cyclops, and no Cyclops, who thought bijectively, knew about pronouns as names, so that the negation term nobody would sound like a pronoun to the listeners, but a name to the speaker. The same diagram works for both stories, only Poe was able to add the witty name for the place the letter was hidden in clear view, the card rack, which is the same forwards or backwards, another case of idempotency. If you are ever trapped into giving a definition of architecture, you might try this to keep your interrogators at bay. Just say that architecture is the material means of establishing spatial closure at the cost of non-orientation. That is simultaneous with establishing non-orientation at the cost of spatial closure. That should put a temporary hold on asking this unanswerable question. Language, our nature as speaking beings, transforms the imaginary, which is structured around the cut of the screen. But we see things in the imaginary, our sense experiences, and suppress this signifying nature. This is the suppressive function of metaphor, to conceal the symbolic within the imaginary so that it appears to be natural. But as if there should be a constant reminder of this suppression, we imagine that nature has something to say to us, but that it speaks in a marvelous code or secret magical ancient language that we must decipher. This fascination with the concealed message of nature begins with the human institutions of divination, instituted at the hearth, thanks to Prometheus, presided over by Hestia and her priestesses, the female members of the household. The Hestias of the hearth must be both a part and not a part of the paternal structure, hence the story of Alcestis, who is a servant and a wife, but willing to take her husband's place in the underworld. Remember that the suppression function of metaphor is the beginning of everything, and the symmetrical difference of seeing and being seen, of repressing and the return of the repressed, by which the repressed has been freed of time and space constraints, made portable. This is contrary to Jung's concept of myth as something buried in artifacts, but the key to unification of the subject. On the contrary, metaphoric suppression and return are a moving, dynamic exchange resulting in the truly human subject who is, from the start, created by the division between being and speaking.